How settled are we? Feeling comfortable? I wonder, is it possible as Jesus followers to become too comfortable? When our world was very young, shortly after the time of Noah, the whole world had one language and a common speech. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used bricks instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come on, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make our name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to the city and the tower that the men were building, and the Lord said, "If as one people, speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, or Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. But what's so wrong with wanting to build a city and settle down, make a name for yourself? Well, in one sense, nothing at all. Apart from that's not what God intended them to do. God had clearly told people to populate the whole world, but rather than do things God's way, people tend to choose comfort and safety. So God comes down and he confuses the language, so the building is stopped and God has his way. The people are scattered across the earth. It's interesting, but in the very next chapter, God comes down again, this time to a man called Abraham. He's comfortable too, but God says to him, "Get up, leave this place where you're comfortable and go to a place I will show you. I'll bless you so that all the people of the world will be blessed." It's like God has a way of coming down and telling people to get out of the comfort zones so that people can be blessed and that God's mission can be fulfilled. You know, the story of God is filled with examples of God calling people out of their comfort zones in order to carry out his purposes. About 2,000 years after Abraham, God came down another time. This time he sends his son, Jesus, in person as a human being like you and me. It's like Jesus left the comfort of his Father's presence in order to shake people out of their comfort zones, calling them back to be the people God made them to be. A people in relationship with God, on mission for God, taking God's blessing to the whole world. Jesus lived amongst people, showing us what this mission might look like. And then he died to make it all possible. 3 days later he rose from the dead. He spent 40 days of finishing school with his disciples before finally leaving them, ascending into heaven. Before he went, he left his commission. "As the Father sends me, I'm sending you. Go into the whole world and make disciples." If we pause for a moment, give ourselves permission to use our imagination, it's possible to imagine that the disciples might have simply gone back to their normal lives, settled down back into business and become comfortable. But God is about to come down again, spectacularly. It was the day of Pentecost, one of the 3 great festivals of the Jewish people. People had come from across the known world to Jerusalem to celebrate the feast. A small band of Jesus followers, about 120 of them, are gathered together when the sound of a great wind and fire comes down and rests upon their heads, and then each of them begins to speak in different languages. Some people watching on thought they'd had too much to drink. It was festival time. But their leader, Peter, stands up and begins to declare the good news of Jesus to all who were listening. Now here's the miracle of Pentecost. People from all over the world are there. They're separated by language. But now as the Jesus followers share the good news of the kingdom of God, each person hears in their own language. The people are amazed, and that day 3,000 of them became Jesus followers. The book of Acts goes on to tell the story of the early church, propelled by the Spirit of God out of comfort and into mission, changing the world. We see many miraculous signs, healing and deliverance, changed lives. They met regularly in each other's homes. They shared meals, they broke bread together. Everything they owned, they shared with one another. I can't help thinking that people looked in awe at how these people loved one another. Luke tells us that every day new people were joining them, becoming Jesus followers. But it wasn't only in the book of Acts that the church thrived. During the next 300 years, led by the Spirit of God, like wildfire, the fledgling church spread across the known world. But it wasn't comfortable. Those early believers experienced immense persecution under the Roman governments. Many were martyred for their faith in Jesus. Following Jesus wasn't safe or comfortable, but the church grew at a rate that hasn't been seen since. In the year 312, the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. The terrible persecution the Jesus followers had experienced ceased. The people could finally settle down. They could finally be comfortable. This is how one historian describes it. In the year 306, when Constantine was first elevated by his father's troops, the imperial government was in the middle of a concerted effort to remove all traces of Christian presence from the empire. By the time Constantine died in 337, Christian leaders had assumed the rank, dress, and increasingly the duties of the old civic elite. Christianity had become respectable. So what happened? The church became comfortable, safe. They settled down, and as the church settled down, so did the spread of the good news of the kingdom of God. But God is still at work. Throughout 2,000 years of church history, we've seen many moves of the Spirit, sometimes in the lives of individuals, sometimes congregations, sometimes whole movements, as the Spirit of God comes down and propels God's people out of their comfort zone and into the life, the relationships and the mission for which they were created. And so I return to the question we started with. Are we too comfortable? What might it look like for us to encounter God's Spirit afresh in such a way that we might be challenged to step away from comfort, away from safety, and to plunge deeper into the life, the relationships and the mission to which we are called, the life, the relationships and the mission which God made us for? What does that look like? I don't know, but are we brave enough to ask the question? Speaking of questions, here are some to ponder. Sit with them, discuss them amongst yourselves, share them in your small groups. As you examine your life, how comfortable are you? What about our church community? How comfortable are we? If you were to rate our comfort and safety on a scale of 1 to 10, how are we going? Why do you think this is the case? What might it look like to begin to imagine that the Spirit of God might move mightily amongst us, challenging us to step out of comfort and to follow His lead into relationships, into mission, and into the life we were created to live? Of course, the Spirit doesn't always speak in wind and fire. Sometimes He's heard in a small voice, a gentle prompting, the words of a brother or a sister. As we ask these questions, what might you be hearing the Spirit of God calling you to today? What do you need to do? How should you be praying?